You won't believe this existed in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, a period that stretched from the 5th to the 15th century, was a time full of contrasts, mysteries, and curiosities that defy our modern understanding. Many of us grew up hearing stories about knights in shining armor, evil witches, and people barely in their 30s. But the reality of that time was much more complex than you imagine. And believe me, you've probably never seen what we're going to tell you now in schools. Now, enjoy this super content, and let's go. Let's start by demystifying one of the most common beliefs about the Middle Ages: life expectancy. Many believe that people rarely lived beyond their 20s or 30s. While it's true that the average life expectancy was significantly shorter than it is today, that doesn't tell the whole story. Infant mortality was, in fact, alarmingly high. Many children did not survive their first year of life, and those who did faced a number of challenges in their early years. Diseases, lack of basic sanitation, and constant wars contributed to this gloomy scenario. However, if a person managed to overcome these initial obstacles and reach the age of 20, their chances of living a long life increased considerably. Believe it or not, it was not uncommon to find people in their 60s, 70s, or even 80s in the Middle Ages. These people were not rare and fragile exceptions, as we might think. Many elderly people actively participated in the political and cultural life of their communities. Of course, this was more common among the nobility and wealthier classes. But even among commoners, long lives were not impossible. Another surprising aspect of medieval life was marriage. While today we have strict laws regarding the minimum age for marriage, in the Middle Ages, things were very different. Once a person reached puberty, they were considered fit for marriage. This means that unions between 14 and 12-year-olds were not seen as strange. But do you know what can be seen strangely? That is if you're not subscribed here to our channel. Take advantage of these 4 seconds and subscribe to our channel to stay up to date with the biggest curiosities in our world. Now that you've done that, let's continue. Noble families often arranged marriages for their children before they even reached puberty. The process involved the exchange of rings and parental consent, often recorded by a priest or monk. In some cases, presence of a clergyman was not even necessary. It was enough for the couple to exchange vows near a church or on their doorstep. A surprising detail about medieval weddings was the role of witnesses. In addition to witnessing the ceremony, in some cases, they were also called to witness the couple's first wedding night. This may seem shocking by today's standards, but it had a purpose: to confirm that the marriage had been consummated, which was considered crucial to its legal and social validity. Speaking of intimate relationships, many imagine the Middle Ages as a period of extreme Puritanism, where sex was seen only as a means of procreation. The reality, however, was much more complex and surprising. Modern studies suggest that sexuality was a central theme in medieval life. Doctors at the time even warned their patients about the dangers of an inactive sexual life. There are records of cases in which wives could accuse their husbands of not fulfilling their conjugal duties. If the accusation is proven, the woman could even receive her ex-husband's properties as compensation. On the other hand, if the husband managed to prove his virility, sometimes in front of witnesses, believe it or not, he kept his possessions and the wife was the loser. It is important to note, however, that attitudes towards sexuality were not uniform throughout the medieval period. As the church's influence grew, especially in the late Middle Ages, social norms became more restrictive. Behavior considered debauched became more strongly condemned, and women, in particular, were told to be modest and demure. Even with these changes, many people continued to live their intimate lives as they had for centuries, even though they took risks in doing so. Those who engaged in same-sex relationships faced even greater dangers. But surprisingly, in some places in Europe, such as Italy, there were even specific taverns where these people could meet discreetly. The Middle Ages are also famous for their beliefs in witchcraft and sorcery. The figure of the witch, so present in the popular imagination, has its roots in this period. It was believed that women became witches by making a pact with the devil, participating in Sabbaths, and communicating with evil spirit. The most shocking thing is that practically any woman could be accused of witchcraft. Elderly women, homeless people, beggars, and people without a fixed residence were frequent targets of these accusations. Characteristics such as having or not having boyfriends, money, or children, or simply presenting behavior considered strange, could lead a woman to be labeled a witch. Witch hunting, although it reached its peak in the 16th century, outside the medieval period, had its roots in the Middle Ages. The Inquisition, made up of monks forced to celibacy, often saw women as vicious creatures, prone to carnal pleasures and capable of making pacts with the devil. Knights, another iconic symbol of the Middle Ages, also have a fascinating and myth-filled history. Contrary to the romanticized image of noble and valiant warriors, many knights were actually wealthy nobles who viewed war as work and did not hesitate to engage in looting and robbery when the opportunity arose. Knights' armor, often portrayed as extremely heavy and difficult to wear, was actually much more practical than people think. A trained knight could don his armor in a matter of minutes, not hours, as many believe. Hygiene in the Middle Ages is a topic that generates a lot of curiosity and misinformation. While it is true that hygiene standards were very different from today, the idea that people never washed themselves is exaggerated. Hygiene practices varied over time and between different social classes. In the early Middle Ages, there was a decline in hygiene practices compared to the ancient world, in part due to the belief that diseases entered the body through the skin. This has led many people to avoid frequent bathing. However, over time, hygiene practices have evolved. People washed their hands and faces regularly, and underwear was washed more frequently than outer clothing. Interestingly, it was at this time that perfumes gained popularity as a way to combat unpleasant odors. However, bathing in the Middle Ages wasn't exactly a luxurious experience. For most people, it meant washing in cold water. Only the wealthiest could afford hot bath. Heating the water with wood burned directly under the bathtub. Sophisticated body care products? No way. What about oral hygiene? Well, it existed, but in a way that you will probably find bizarre. Instead of toothpaste, people used ash, charcoal, or resin. Herbal mouthwashes were also popular. Interestingly, tooth decay was considered a noble disease, as it indicated that a person could afford to eat sweet foods, which were rare and expensive at the time. Speaking of drinks, prepare to be surprised. The Middle Ages could be called the age of mild alcohol intoxication. This is because weak alcoholic beverages were one of the safest options to drink. The water, in many places, was unsafe for consumption, full of dangerous bacteria. So people often opted for light beers or diluted wines, as the alcohol helped kill some of the germs. But don't think that everyone was drunk. People also drank boiled water and developed the habit of preparing herbal decoctions, which required hot, clean water. Another unusual practice was the use of pet dogs, which, believe it or not, were seen as a way of attracting fleas and other parasites away from their owners. As we move through the history of the Middle Ages, we realize that this period was much more than simply a dark age. You won't believe it, but pet dogs in the Middle Ages had a very different function than what we imagine today. While today they are status symbols and adorable companions, back then, they were true warriors against poor sanitary conditions. Believe it or not, these little dogs were tied up to attract fleas and other parasites, keeping them away from their owners. Peculiar but apparently effective solution. With all these conditions, it is no wonder that illnesses were common. Doctors at the time had treatment methods that seem shocking to us today. Bloodletting, for example, was used for almost everything, but there were even scarier procedures. From immersing the patient in boiling water, to treating hemorrhoids with a hot iron, or even making small holes in the skull. Anesthesia existed, but it was primitive. Patients still felt much of what the doctor did. And here's something that will blow your mind. Doctors didn't wash their hands before examining patients. This habit was only adopted centuries later. One of the consequences of these poor medical practices was the rapid spread of diseases, especially in times of epidemics. The most famous of these was the Black Death pandemic that reached its peak in the 14th century. It is estimated to have killed 30 to 60% of the European population, possibly reaching 200 million victims worldwide. Plague doctors, with their iconic beak-shaped masks filled with aromatic herbs, tried to combat the disease. However, these masks did little against the pneumonic form of the plague, and the death rate among doctors was as high as among the general population. Another fascinating aspect of the Middle Ages were cemeteries. Unlike today, they were not just places of sadness and mourning. Believe it or not, medieval cemeteries were centers of social activity. They served as venues for elections, sermons, public debates, trials, and even plays. At night, they became meeting points for less recommended activities. Due to limited space, cemeteries had a peculiar practice. After a certain time, the remains were removed and reburied in ossuaries, known as ossuary. These could be anything from small boxes to entire walls of bones reaching kilometers in length. Some of these structures still exist today and are true works of macabre art. It is important to remember that when we talk about the Middle Ages, we are generally referring to Europe. But other parts of the world, such as Asia, also had their own medieval periods, each with its own unique characteristic. The Middle Ages were, without a doubt, a period of extreme contrast. On the one hand, we see practices that today we would consider barbaric or unhealthy. On the other hand, we find innovations, creative adaptations, and a cultural richness that continues to fascinate us. Every aspect of medieval life, from personal hygiene to medical practices to social customs, offers us a window into a world that, although distant, helped shape the society we live in today. Now, let's go to Japan. In medieval Japan, it had its own legendary warriors, the samurai, whose story is as interesting as that of European knights. One of the most famous samurai in history was Miyamoto Musashi. Born in 1584, known as the Invincible Samurai, Musashi began his warrior career at a very young age, having his first fight at the age of 13. Throughout his life, he participated in more than 60 battles and emerged victorious in all of them. What made Musashi so formidable? In addition to his exceptional skill with a sword, he was a master of psychological strategy. In his famous duel against Kojiro, for example, Musashi arrived hours late on purpose to destabilize his opponent. He was also known for using unusual tactics, such as fighting with wooden swords against opponents armed with sharp katanas. But Musashi was not just a warrior, he was also a philosopher and writer. His book, The Book of Five Rings, remains an influential work to this day, not only in martial arts but also in strategy and business. It's important to note that Musashi was technically a ronin, a masterless samurai. Ronin were samurai who had lost their masters or failed to protect them, and were forced to wander without a defined purpose. Speaking of samurai, many of us have a romanticized image of these warriors, but the reality was very different from what we imagine. Samurai didn't spend all their time fighting. In fact, during periods of peace, many of them worked as farmers or in other occupations. Surprisingly, despite being considered the elite of Japanese society, many samurai faced financial difficulty. Their salary was paid in rice, and an average samurai received about 4 to 5 tons of rice per year, which may seem like a lot, but in reality, it barely covered their basic needs. A samurai's training began very early. Around 3 years of age, they not only learned fighting techniques, but also philosophy, poetry, and other cultural aspects. The samurai code of honor, known as Bushido, emphasized virtues such as loyalty, courage, and self-control. An interesting aspect of samurai culture was the presence of female warriors, known as onabugeisha. These women were trained in martial arts and were expected to defend their homes and families in the absence of men. Samurai armor was a work of art in itself. Made of steel plates covered with silk and leather, they were surprisingly light compared to European knights' armor, weighing between 12 and 15 kilograms. This allowed greater freedom of movement in battle. One of the most shocking aspects of samurai culture was the practice of seppuku, or harakiri, ritual suicide. If a samurai believed he had dishonored himself or his lord, he might choose to commit seppuku as a way of restoring his honor. Furthermore, and it was possible for foreigners to become samurai, although it was extremely rare. One of the most famous cases was that of the Englishman William Adams, who became an advisor to Shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu and was elevated to the position of samurai. The history of samurai shows us that the Middle Ages were not just a European phenomenon. Cultures around the world have developed their own warrior tradition, codes of honor, and complex social structures. Medieval Japan, with its samurai, shoguns, and codes of honor, was as rich a world as Europe of knights and castles. And did you know any of these interesting facts we told you about the Middle Ages? Which one shocked you the most? Tell me below in the comment. Well, that's it, and until next time, curious.